It's Brian Preston, the Money Guy.
There are some things that have actually made why is the FIRE journey harder now. Let's talk about a few of these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The first one that kind of comes to mind is inflation. If you read any sort of financial publication right now, it seems to be a headline because if you are part of the FIRE movement, over the last decade, you've probably been modeling 3% inflation, 4% inflation. Then all of a sudden, we get into 2021, 2022, and those numbers don't apply anymore. Things have changed a little bit. So we said, okay, let's not lose track of the long term. If we want to be really good planners, we got to think long term. And let's look at U.S. inflation rates going all the way back to the 1970s. Well, what you can see is really for the past 40 years or so, we've been in a relatively moderated inflationary period. Yeah, it might get as high as 6% or it might get low to 0%. But by and large, it probably hovers around that average. It does look like right now what we're seeing in this country is unique relative to what we've seen since the last, late 1970s.
Yeah, it's 40 years. I mean, 40 years since we've had inflation moments like this. That obviously is going to, because think about best laid plans is you have to put your assumptions in of what you think life will look like since you are leaving the workforce early. Inflation is one of the worst things that you could face.
That's exactly right.
Because it blows up a lot of your assumptions in a lot of different ways. So just be aware of that. And that's a great segue also into the next thing because we all need shelter.
Yep.
I mean, and housing, because of inflation, has gotten substantially more expensive, and that's having a big impact. Here's what I think is interesting, Bo, and I'll let you kind of lay this out. We've had so much growth in housing just in the 2020s. What is this chart that you pulled up actually showing?
Yeah, so we actually show by decade how much housing has increased. So in the 1990s, housing went up about 31%.
Appreciated, the value of a house went up.
Cost of housing. In the 2000s, there's about 45% appreciation over that decade. In the 2010s, there was about 47% price appreciation that decade. In the 2020s, so far, so realize we're on the early end of this. It's 2020, 2021, 2022. We've already seen 42% price appreciation in housing. In really the last 2 years, we have covered the amount of ground that it normally takes a full decade to cover when it comes to real estate value increase. That's problematic, especially for folks who want to relocate and live in a different part of the country.
Now, the glass half empty is that this is just going to keep going in housing. But let me tell you the glass half full. I see if you look at the historical norms, 31, 45, 47, we're already at 42 just in the first 2 to 3 years of this decade. That probably means that housing appreciation is going to be somewhat stagnant. It's not going to move at the same pace.
Reversion
I think
to the mean.
There will be a reversion to the mean, likely. So I would just tell you, hey, hang in there. If you're one of these people that's struggling with the cost of housing and you're trying to figure out how this fits into your plan to be financially independent even earlier than most, I think that there's actually a glimmer of understanding that it's going to be, I think that it will hopefully settle down. That's my glass half full outlook.
What I think is really interesting is that both of these things, both inflation as well as housing, are examples of blind spots that can exist in your financial plan. Well, if you've not accounted for blind spots as best you can, I mean, we only know so many unknown unknowns, and if you've not stress tested your portfolio, right now you are probably facing some headwinds. One of the things we do for our clients is we walk through, okay, here's what we think could happen. Here's what we think is a highly probable outcome if you're going to leave the workforce and you're going to retire, whether it's early or on a normal schedule. And then we start playing with variables. Well, what happens if your spending increases? What happens if it decreases? What happens if you retire earlier? What happens if you retire later? What I think is really amazing is that people get this idea in their head, like, okay, here's my goal. I know that I need to live off of $80,000 a year. If I can just get to $1 million, I bet I'll be okay. If I can just hit that 7-figure mark, I'm going to retire and I'm going to sell off into the sunset. Well, if you are a 50-year-old retiring with $1 million, that is very different than a 65-year-old retiring with $1 million. Because you may actually put this into a Monte Carlo software, run through a stress test, and you might say, uh-oh, things don't look quite as good as I thought they were. You want to know this on the front end. Way too often, people get so excited about what financial independence looks like, what life on the other side of the fence looks like, they don't ever take into account the other scenarios, like what happens if inflation is worse than I expected? What happens if spending is higher than I planned? Now, what happened if the cost of housing is different than I expect? These all have very real ramifications on the viability of your plan for the long term.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, look, we're in the content space where we give great information to help you accelerate that whole learn, apply, grow to reach your own level of success. But there are limits to it because general advice, general planning, napkin financial plans that you can do through safe withdrawal rates, they do reach their limits, especially as you're about 5 years from retirement. You need to have some way to stress test. You need to have some way to make sure what are you not protected from that you just are unaware of, because you're doing one retirement. Having somebody in your court that's done hundreds of them, it can that knowledge, that skill set can be very helpful. So just be careful. Pay attention to blind spots. Be careful of overconfidence, because that's the one thing we talked about. The positive of having this community, there also can be this overconfidence, because I will tell you, if you type in there that you're talking to a financial advisor or anything, the FIRE movement is notorious for throwing shade, because I think all they think financial planners do is asset allocation. And I'm like, yeah, you can go we actually use index funds. Anybody can use index funds. If you're just buying VTI all the time, if you total market index or something like that, you're probably like, what would a financial planner do for me? Trust me, complexity, life decisions, especially big financial life decisions, will happen naturally. Roth conversions, how the impact of Social Security plus your retirement withdrawals, the Medicare, premiums, and how all that plays. There's a lot of complexity that's going to happen that you'll eventually want to make sure you have a co-pilot to take it to the next level.
A second ago, Brian, you said overconfidence. That reminds me of another thing we often see in the FIRE community. We often take for granted, when we are in our peak earning years, that it's really easy to get back on that treadmill. Okay, well, I'm going to try this, and if it doesn't work, I'll just hop right back in. I can't tell you how many folks we've had who've told us, man, I worked in this career field for 15 years, 20 years, and I got out. And the rate and the speed at which technology changes, 2 to 3 years in the future, my skills were obsolete. If I was not in it, I was losing that. So make sure, before you make that big decision to exit, you understand the ramifications, because getting back in the game may not be as easy as you think that it is.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't in what we had talked about, but my next door neighbor, he had sold a portion. He worked in an IT company, had sold that, and then was working in sales for a few years while he's waiting for his non-compete to play out. He's now back in another company. And even at dinner, he was like, I forget the speed that this industry moves. I mean, and it's one of those things. So, and you made a key point a few seconds ago. Peak earning years, if you statistically, it's your late 40s, early 50s. Well, I know the FIRE movement, that's kind of when a lot of the people are trying to leave. Just be careful, because those are your peak earning years, and you just want to make sure you measure twice, cut once, do it well, plan well, so you don't have something derail your best well intentions, but just because you didn't do all the work.